The water came faster than anyone expected. Elena Brooks woke to the sound of her own front door groaning under the weight of rising water pressing against it from outside. She threw off her blanket, and her bare feet landed in cold water already covering the floor of her small apartment. Her heart slammed against her chest. She grabbed her phone, a jacket, and nothing else, because there was no time for anything else. Outside, the street had become a river. Cars floated sideways. Streetlights flickered and died one by one, throwing the whole block into a strange, moving darkness. Rain fell so hard it stung her skin like tiny needles. She tried calling her sister, but the call would not connect. She tried her landlord, her neighbor, anyone. Nothing worked. The signal was gone, swallowed by the storm. She had no car. She had no shelter. The water was rising past her ankles, then her knees, and she knew if she stayed on the ground floor of her building one more hour, she would not be able to leave at all. So she ran. She ran through water that pulled at her legs like it wanted to keep her, past buildings with dark windows and shut doors, past a fallen tree blocking half the road, until the neighborhood she knew disappeared behind her, and unfamiliar streets took its place. Her lungs burned. Her legs ached. The rain did not stop, not even for a second, as if the sky itself had decided this night would not end. She kept moving, because stopping meant sinking, and sinking meant the water would win. Then she saw it. Through the sheets of rain, past a line of tall black trees bending in the wind, a single light glowed steady and warm. A house, large, old, sitting on a small hill above the floodline, untouched by the water climbing everywhere else. It looked like something from a different time, with stone walls and tall windows, the kind of house that belonged in an old photograph rather than in the middle of a modern flood. Elena did not think twice. She had no plan beyond survival, and survival meant reaching that light before the water reached her first. She climbed the slope, slipping twice on wet grass, catching herself on a low stone wall that scraped her palms. She did not feel the pain. She only felt the need to get inside, to be dry, to be safe. She reached the door and pounded on it with both fists. The sound of her own knocking felt small against the roar of the storm behind her. "Please," she said, though no one could hear her yet. "Please, someone help me." For a long moment, nothing happened. The rain kept falling. The wind kept pushing at her back like it wanted to throw her back down the hill toward the flood. She knocked again, harder, calling out louder this time, her voice cracking from the cold and the fear. Then, slowly, the door opened. Warm light spilled out first, followed by the shape of a man standing in the doorway. He was tall, taller than anyone Elena had ever stood in front of, with dark hair pushed back from his face and eyes that seemed to study her with more attention than the moment required. He wore a simple dark shirt, nothing fancy, yet something about the way he stood made the doorway feel like the entrance to somewhere far more important than an ordinary home. He did not speak right away. His eyes moved over her, taking in her soaked clothes, her shaking hands, the fear written plainly across her face. For a second, Elena thought he might close the door. There was something careful in his expression, something that looked almost like hesitation, as if letting her inside was a decision that carried more weight than she could understand.
"Please,"
she said again, her voice breaking. "The flood. I don't have anywhere else to go." His jaw tightened. He glanced past her, out toward the water, climbing the hill behind her, then back to her face. Whatever he saw there made up his mind. "Come inside," he said. His voice was low and steady, carrying a strange calm that did not match the chaos of the storm at all. "You will not survive out there much longer." She stepped past him into the warmth of the house, and the door closed behind her with a heavy sound that shut out most of the storm's noise. For the first time in what felt like hours, she was not fighting against wind and water. She stood dripping onto a wooden floor, shivering, grateful, and entirely unaware of how much her life had just changed. The inside of the house was even more surprising than the outside. High ceilings stretched above her, held up by wooden beams that looked centuries old. A large fireplace burned at the far end of the room, throwing warm orange light across furniture that seemed both expensive and strangely out of time, as if it belonged in a museum rather than someone's home. Paintings hung on the walls, old ones, their frames dark and heavy. "You are freezing," the man said, studying her again. "Come closer to the fire." Elena did not argue. She walked toward the fireplace on legs that still trembled from the cold and the run. She held her hands out toward the flames, feeling warmth spread slowly back into her fingers. "Thank you," she said, turning to look at him properly for the first time. Up close, his eyes were a shade of gray she had never seen before, pale and sharp, like something carved from stone rather than grown naturally. "I didn't think anyone would answer. Most people would have locked their door and stayed inside." "I almost did," he admitted, and there was something guarded in the way he said it, like the truth cost him something to share. "Storms like this bring strange things." "I'm not strange," Elena said, managing a small, tired smile. "Just wet and desperate." The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile, but close to one. "I am Gideon," he said. "Elena," she replied. "Elena Brooks." He nodded slowly, as if her name meant something to him, though she could not imagine why it would. A woman appeared from a side hallway then, older, dressed neatly despite the late hour, carrying a folded blanket and a stack of dry clothes. "This is Agnes," Gideon said. "She will help you get dry and find you a place to rest." Agnes offered a small, polite smile, though her eyes held the same careful watchfulness Elena had noticed in Gideon. "This way, dear," Agnes said, gesturing toward the hallway. "Let's get you out of those wet things before you catch a chill." Elena followed her, glancing back once toward Gideon, who stood by the fire watching her leave with an expression she could not quite read. It was not suspicion. Not exactly. It was something closer to concern mixed with caution, like a man watching a storm he could not predict. Agnes led her down a long hallway lined with closed doors, all identical, all silent. At the very end, one door stood slightly open, spilling soft lamplight into the hall. "You'll stay here tonight," Agnes said, pushing the door open fully to reveal a bedroom that looked untouched by time, with a large bed, heavy curtains, and old wooden furniture polished to a shine. "Thank you," Elena said, stepping inside. "This is more than I expected. I thought I might be sleeping on someone's porch tonight." Agnes chuckled softly, though the sound did not quite reach her eyes. "This house has seen many storms," she said. "It knows how to keep people safe." There was something in the way she said it, a small strangeness Elena almost missed. She set the dry clothes on the bed and turned to leave, then paused at the door. "One thing," Agnes said, her tone shifting slightly, becoming more serious. "Please stay in this wing of the house. The hallway past the library, the one with the tall red door, is not open to guests." Elena blinked, caught off guard by the sudden seriousness. "Is something wrong with it?" "It is simply not open to guests," Agnes repeated, her voice gentle but firm, leaving no room for further questions. "Rest well, dear. The storm will pass by morning." She left before Elena could ask anything else, closing the door softly behind her. Elena stood alone in the quiet room, listening to the muffled sound of rain against the tall windows, and felt a strange mix of relief and unease settle over her. She was safe from the flood, that much was certain. But something about this house, about the careful way Gideon had studied her, the odd warning about a hallway she had never heard of before tonight, told her that stepping through that front door might have led her into a different kind of danger altogether. She changed into the dry clothes left for her, soft and clearly expensive, though they fit her almost too well for something meant for a stranger. She sat on the edge of the bed, running her hands over the fabric, trying to make sense of the night. Hours ago she had been asleep in her own bed, worrying about nothing more than rent and work and ordinary things. Now she sat in a stranger's house on a hill above a flood, warned away from a hallway with a red door, wrapped in clothes that fit like they had been made for her. Outside, the storm continued, but here, inside these thick stone walls, it felt distant, almost unreal. She lay back against the pillows, exhaustion finally pulling at her, though sleep did not come easily. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Gideon's pale gray eyes, studying her, like she was something he needed to understand, something unexpected, that had arrived at his door, and could not simply be sent back out into the storm. At some point near midnight, she woke to the sound of low voices somewhere deep in the house, too quiet to make out words, carrying a strange rhythm that did not sound quite like normal conversation. She lay still, listening, telling herself it was only the wind moving through old walls, only the storm playing tricks on tired ears. But some quiet part of her, the same part that had chosen to run toward a lit window instead of staying in a flooding apartment, knew that the sound she heard was not the wind at all. Something else lived in this house, something that moved through its halls at night and spoke in tones too low and too strange to be entirely human. She pulled the blanket higher, telling herself she would ask questions in the morning, once the sun returned and the storm passed and the world felt normal again. But as she finally drifted into an uneasy sleep, she could not shake the feeling that the man who had opened the door for her, the man with the careful gray eyes and the ancient house on the hill, was hiding something far larger than a locked hallway and a closed red door. Outside, the rain continued to fall, and far below the hill, the flood kept rising, cutting off any path back to the world Elena had known before tonight. Before sleep finally took her, Elena replayed the entire night in her mind, trying to make sense of how quickly everything had changed. Only hours earlier she had been folding laundry in her small apartment, worrying about an unpaid bill and a work deadline that suddenly felt meaningless. Then the water had come, and within minutes, her ordinary life had been swept away, replaced by a run through darkness, a stranger's door, and a house that felt like it belonged to a different century entirely. She thought about the way Gideon had looked at her in that first moment, the careful hesitation before he stepped aside to let her in, as though opening that door required more courage from him than it had from her to knock on it. She thought about the warmth of the fire, the quiet strength in his voice, the way Agnes had appeared almost silently to guide her through halls that seemed too large for any single family to fill. Somewhere far below the hill, sirens wailed faintly through the storm, rescue crews working through the night to pull people from flooded homes. Elena said a quiet, grateful prayer for anyone still caught in the water, glad she had found dry ground before the flood swallowed the last of the low streets completely. She thought of her sister, hoping the message she had managed to send before her phone died had reached her, hoping her sister was not lying awake somewhere, worrying about a silence that meant nothing more than a dead battery and a stranger's kindness. The storm outside seemed to ease slightly as the night wore on, the wind losing some of its earlier fury, though rain continued to tap steadily against the tall windows of her room. Elena pulled the warm blanket higher and closed her eyes, telling herself that morning would bring answers, that daylight always made strange nights feel smaller and more manageable. She did not yet know how wrong that comforting thought would turn out to be, nor how far the strangeness of this house would stretch once the sun finally rose over the flooded valley below. For now, she was trapped here, in a house that felt both like the safest place she had ever been, and somehow, like the beginning of something she was not yet ready to understand. Morning light came through the tall curtains before Elena fully understood where she was. For a moment, lying in the unfamiliar bed, she forgot about the flood, forgot about the storm, forgot about the strange house on the hill. Then memory returned all at once, and she sat up quickly, glancing around the room as if to confirm it had all been real. It had. The heavy furniture, the tall windows, the soft clothes she had changed into last night, all of it remained exactly as she remembered. Somewhere beyond the walls, she could hear faint movement, footsteps, the quiet sounds of a house waking up around her. She dressed in the clothes Agnes had left, still fitting oddly well for something meant for a stranger, and stepped out into the hallway. The storm outside had softened into a steady drizzle, though through a nearby window she could see the flood had not gone down at all. If anything, the water at the base of the hill looked higher than the night before, a wide brown lake where streets used to be. She was trapped here, at least for now. Following the sound of voices, she found her way to a large dining room, where a table long enough for 20 people held food for two. Gideon sat at the head of the table, dressed simply again, reading something on a tablet with the same focused stillness she had noticed in him last night. He looked up when she entered, and something in his expression shifted, softened slightly. "You slept well, I hope," he said, setting the tablet aside. "Better than I expected, given the circumstances," Elena admitted, taking the seat Agnes gestured toward. "Thank you again, for letting me in. I don't know what I would have done otherwise." "You would have found another way," Gideon said, an odd certainty in his voice, as if he already understood something about her that she had not yet told him. People who run toward light, instead of hiding from storms, usually do. Elena laughed softly, unsure how to respond to that. "I just saw a house with the light still on. That's not exactly bravery." "It is more than most would do," he said, and left it there. Breakfast passed with polite conversation. Gideon asked about her life, her work, her family, listening with careful attention to every answer, as though memorizing details rather than simply making small talk. Elena found herself relaxing slightly, charmed despite herself by his quiet intensity, his old-fashioned way of speaking, the strange formality that seemed to belong to another century entirely. "The flood should clear in a few days," Gideon said eventually. "Until then, please consider this house your shelter. Agnes will make sure you have everything you need." "A few days," Elena repeated, glancing toward the window again. "I don't want to be a burden." "You are not a burden," he said simply, and something in his tone closed the subject entirely. After breakfast, Elena explored the parts of the house Agnes had shown her were open to guests. A large library filled with old books, a sitting room with tall windows overlooking the flooded valley below, a music room with an old piano no one seemed to play anymore. Everything in the house felt preserved rather than simply old, as if great care had been taken to keep every object exactly as it had always been. It was in the library that she first noticed the portrait. It hung on the far wall, half hidden behind a tall bookshelf, easy to miss unless someone stood in exactly the right spot. Elena almost walked past it, but something about the eyes in the painting caught her attention and pulled her back. She stepped closer, studying the face in the portrait, and felt a small chill move down her spine. The man in the painting looked exactly like Gideon. Not similar, not close, but exactly like him, down to the same pale gray eyes and the same set of his jaw. The clothing in the portrait, however, belonged to a different time entirely, old-fashioned in a way that suggested the painting itself was very, very old. She leaned closer, searching for a signature or a date, and found a small brass plaque at the bottom of the frame, tarnished with age. The name etched into it read simply, Gideon. Below the name, a date, faded but still legible. Elena stared at the numbers for a long moment, doing the math in her head, certain she had made a mistake. The date on the portrait placed it more than 200 years in the past. "You found the old paintings," a voice said behind her, and Elena turned quickly to find Agnes standing in the doorway, her expression carefully neutral. "This looks exactly like Gideon," Elena said, gesturing toward the portrait, trying to keep her voice light despite the strange unease building in her chest. "It is uncanny. Is it a relative? An ancestor, maybe?" Agnes's smile did not quite reach her eyes. "Family resemblance can be a strange thing in old bloodlines," she said smoothly. "This house has many old paintings. Perhaps you would enjoy the music room instead. The piano has a lovely view of the valley." Elena let herself be guided away from the portrait, though the image of those pale gray eyes staring out from a painting more than 2 centuries old stayed with her long after she left the library. She told herself there had to be a simple explanation. Family lines could carry strong resemblances across generations. It happened all the time. Still, something about the moment refused to settle comfortably in her mind. That evening, dinner was quieter than breakfast had been. Gideon seemed distracted, his eyes occasionally drifting toward the windows, toward the darkening sky outside, as if listening for something Elena could not hear. She found herself watching him more closely than before, noticing small things she had missed the previous night. The way he moved with an unusual, contained grace. The way his eyes seemed to catch even faint light and reflect it back, almost like an animal's eyes might. "Is everything all right?" she asked, when the silence between courses stretched too long. Gideon's eyes met hers, and for a moment, something flickered behind them, something careful and guarded. "The storm is not finished with us yet," he said. "There may be more difficult nights ahead." "More flooding?" Elena asked. "Something like that," he answered, though his tone suggested he meant something else entirely. After dinner, restless and unable to settle into sleep, Elena wandered the halls again, drawn back toward the library despite Agnes's earlier redirection. She wanted another look at that portrait, wanted to convince herself the resemblance had simply been a trick of lighting and her own tired imagination. The library was empty and dim, lit only by the last embers of a dying fire. She crossed to the far wall where the portrait hung, and studied it again in the low light. The eyes still seemed to watch her, pale and knowing, exactly like Gideon's. A floorboard creaked somewhere behind her, and Elena spun around, heart racing, half expecting to find Gideon standing there. Instead, the room remained empty, though the hallway beyond the library door stood dark and silent in a way that felt heavier than ordinary silence. She made her way back toward her room, moving quickly now, telling herself the strange feeling crawling up her spine was simply exhaustion and stress from the flood. She passed the hallway Agnes had warned her about, the one with the tall red door at its end, and paused, despite herself. The door stood slightly open. Just a crack, barely noticeable, but enough that a thin line of darkness showed where light should have been blocked out completely. Elena knew she should keep walking, should return to her room and forget she had ever seen it. But curiosity, the same curiosity that had once made her the kind of person who ran toward lit windows during storms, held her feet in place. She took one step toward the red door, then stopped, as a low sound reached her ears from somewhere deep within that forbidden hallway. It was not quite a growl, and not quite a voice, something between the two, deep and resonant, carrying a weight that made the hair on her arms rise. Elena backed away slowly, then turned and hurried back toward her room, her heart pounding, refusing to look behind her even once. She closed her door and leaned against it, breathing hard, trying to convince herself she had imagined the sound entirely. But she knew, somewhere deep down, that she had not imagined anything at all. Something lived behind that red door, something the house was very carefully built to hide, and whatever it was, it had made a sound unlike anything Elena had ever heard from anything human. She spent the rest of the night with the lamp burning beside her bed, sleep refusing to come easily, her mind circling endlessly around a painting 2 centuries old, a forbidden hallway, and a low growling sound that still echoed faintly in her memory. She thought about calling out, about knocking on Gideon's door, and demanding an explanation right then, in the middle of the night, rather than waiting politely for morning. But something about the heavy silence that had settled over the house after the sound stopped made her hesitate. It felt, somehow, like the wrong moment to ask questions, like the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for her to simply go back to sleep and pretend she had heard nothing at all. Instead, she pulled out her phone, which had finally regained a small amount of charge from the outlet beside her bed, and opened a search engine out of pure restless curiosity. She typed in a few careful words, old family portraits, identical resemblance generations, and scrolled through articles about genetics and rare family traits, trying to convince herself that science could explain what she had seen in that painting. Some of the articles mentioned unusual cases of striking resemblance across generations, enough to plant a small seed of doubt about her own assumptions, though none of it fully explained the growling sound or the strange formality of a house staff that treated an ordinary guest with such careful, practiced caution. She thought about Agnes's warning regarding the red door, delivered with a gentleness that somehow made it feel more serious rather than less. Rules given kindly, Elena had learned over the years, were often the ones worth taking most seriously, because kindness was frequently used to soften something people did not want questioned too closely. Eventually, exhaustion overtook her curiosity, and her eyes grew heavy despite the questions still circling through her mind. She drifted toward sleep slowly, images of pale gray eyes and centuries-old paintings following her into uneasy dreams, the sound of that low growl echoing faintly in her memory, long after the house had gone completely silent again. By the third morning, the flood outside had not moved an inch. If anything, the water below the hill looked darker, angrier, swirling around half-submerged rooftops that used to be homes. Elena stood at the sitting room window, watching the gray sky press down over the valley, and felt the weight of being trapped settle deeper into her chest. She had not told Gideon about the sound behind the red door. She was not entirely sure why. Some instinct told her that bringing it up directly might close a door of a different kind, one that had only just begun to open between them. Instead, she watched him more carefully, searching for answers in the small details he could not fully hide. She noticed how the staff moved through the house with a strange, practiced silence, never startled, never surprised, as though they had lived through countless similar mornings before. She noticed how Agnes always seemed to appear exactly when needed, and disappear just as quickly, never far from Gideon, always watching Elena with quiet, careful eyes. At breakfast, she decided to test something small. Agnes mentioned this house has been in your family a long time, Elena said casually, watching Gideon's face for any reaction. That portrait in the library, the one that looks so much like you. How far back does your family go? Gideon's expression remained calm, though something behind his eyes sharpened slightly, like a man recalculating a conversation he had not expected to have this early. Further than most families care to track, he said. Old houses collect old stories. Not all of them are worth repeating. I'd like to hear one anyway, Elena said, trying to keep her tone light. I have nowhere else to be. A faint smile crossed his lips, though it did not fully reach his eyes. Patience, Elena. Some stories are better told slowly. She let the subject drop, though the answer left her with more questions than before. After breakfast, Gideon excused himself, saying he had matters to attend to elsewhere in the house, matters he did not explain further. Elena watched him disappear down the same hallway that led, eventually, toward the forbidden red door, and felt her curiosity twist tighter in her chest. She spent the rest of the morning in the library, this time reading rather than exploring, though her eyes kept drifting toward the portrait on the far wall. She noticed something she had missed before. A small shelf beneath the painting, holding a row of old leather books, their spines cracked with age. Carefully, she pulled one free and opened it. The pages were filled with handwriting, elegant and old-fashioned, recording dates and names she did not recognize. Near the top of one page, a phrase caught her attention, written in careful ink: "The pack gathers at the rise of the full moon." Elena frowned, reading the line again. A pack. The word felt oddly specific, oddly deliberate, nothing like the vague language a normal family record might use. She flipped further through the pages, finding more references to a pack, to gatherings, to something called the Old Bloodline, and to a title that appeared again and again throughout the book: Alpha. She closed the book quickly when she heard footsteps approaching, sliding it back onto the shelf just as Agnes appeared in the doorway. "There you are," Agnes said, her tone pleasant but her eyes flicking briefly toward the shelf Elena had just touched. "Lunch is being prepared. Master Gideon asked that I find you." "Master Gideon," Elena repeated slowly, following Agnes out of the library. "That's a formal way to refer to him." "Old habits," Agnes said simply, offering nothing more. Lunch passed quietly, though Elena found it harder than before to focus on ordinary conversation. Her mind kept circling back to the strange word she had read: the pack, the old bloodline, the title that felt too significant to be a simple family nickname. She wanted answers, but every attempt to ask directly seemed to lead only to careful, polished non-answers. That afternoon, the rain returned harder than before, hammering against the windows with renewed force. Gideon appeared restless throughout the day, checking the windows often, exchanging quiet words with members of the staff that Elena could not quite overhear. Something was building, some tension she could sense but not name, and it seemed to be growing worse as daylight faded into evening. As night fell, Elena found herself unable to settle in her room. She paced the floor, replaying the strange words from the old book in her mind, listening to the storm outside grow louder and angrier with each passing hour. Around midnight, a new sound reached her ears, one that made her blood run cold. It was the same low growl she had heard the night before, except now it was joined by others, multiple voices layered together in a chorus that was neither fully animal nor fully human. The sound rolled through the house like distant thunder, deep and resonant, coming from somewhere beyond the forbidden hallway. Elena crept to her door and opened it just a crack, peering out into the dark corridor. The sounds grew slightly louder, carrying an odd rhythm, almost like some kind of ritual chant layered beneath the growling. She stepped out into the hallway despite every instinct warning her to stay inside, drawn forward by a curiosity she could not fully control. She followed the sound as quietly as she could, moving past closed doors, past the library, until she reached the edge of the forbidden hallway once more. This time the red door stood open wider than before, and pale light spilled from somewhere deep within, flickering unevenly like firelight. Elena's heart pounded so hard she could hear it in her own ears. She should turn back. She knew she should turn back. But she took another step forward instead, drawn by the strange rhythm of sound rolling toward her from the open door. Then, suddenly, the growling stopped. Silence fell so completely and so suddenly that it felt like a physical weight pressing against her chest. Elena froze in place, every nerve in her body screaming at her to run, when a shape moved in the darkness ahead of her, tall and broad, stepping fully into the pale light spilling from the open door. It was Gideon. Except something about him was different now. His eyes, usually pale gray, seemed to glow faintly in the low light, catching and reflecting it in a way no human eyes ever could. His posture had shifted too, more coiled, more alert, radiating a kind of contained power that made the hair on Elena's arms rise instantly. "You should not be here," he said, his voice lower than usual, carrying an edge she had not heard from him before. "I heard sounds," Elena said, her voice trembling despite her attempt to stay calm. Voices, growling, like nothing I have ever heard before. What is happening in this house, Gideon? For a long moment, he said nothing, simply watching her with those strange glowing eyes, his expression caught somewhere between frustration and something closer to worry. Go back to your room, he said finally, his voice softer now, though no less firm. Please, Elena, not tonight. There are things happening here that you are not ready to understand, and revealing them carelessly could put you in more danger than you realize. Danger from what? She pressed, refusing to move, despite every instinct telling her to obey him. From you? From whatever is behind that door? Something shifted in his expression, a flash of pain crossing his features so briefly she almost missed it. Not from me, he said quietly. Never from me. But there are others in this world who would see a human who knows too much as a problem to be solved, not a person to be protected. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning Elena could not yet fully grasp. Before she could ask another question, a second figure appeared in the hallway behind Gideon, taller even than him, with sharp eyes that studied Elena like a predator studying unexpected prey. Gideon, the stranger said, his voice carrying a low warning. The human should not be here. She was leaving, Gideon said firmly, stepping slightly in front of Elena, a protective gesture that surprised her with its intensity. Return inside, Marcus. This does not concern you. The one called Marcus lingered a moment longer, his gaze flicking between Gideon and Elena with open suspicion, before finally turning and disappearing back through the red door without another word. The silence that followed felt heavier than before, thick with unspoken tension. Please, Gideon said again, turning back to Elena, his voice quieter now, almost pleading. Go back to your room. I will explain everything. I promise you that. But not tonight. Not like this. Elena studied his face for a long moment, torn between fear and an overwhelming need to understand what she had stumbled into. Finally, she nodded slowly and turned to walk back down the hallway, her legs shaking with every step. Behind her, she heard the heavy red door close with a final, echoing sound, sealing away whatever secrets lived beyond it. She returned to her room and sat on the edge of the bed for a long time, staring at nothing, replaying the glow of Gideon's eyes and the low, dangerous warning in the stranger's voice. Whatever was happening in this house, it was far larger and far stranger than any simple explanation could cover. Sleep did not come easily that night, and when it finally did, it brought strange, fragmented dreams filled with pale, glowing eyes and old, handwritten pages describing gatherings beneath a full moon. Elena woke several times before dawn, each time convinced for a moment that she had heard footsteps outside her door, only to find the hallway empty and silent when she checked. By the time morning light finally broke through the clouds, Elena felt exhausted in a way that had little to do with lack of sleep, and everything to do with the sheer weight of unanswered questions pressing against her mind. She dressed slowly, replaying the image of Marcus's sharp, suspicious eyes, the low warning in his voice, the strange, protective way Gideon had positioned himself between her and whatever lay beyond that red door. She found Agnes in the kitchen preparing breakfast, and for a moment considered asking her directly about what had happened the previous night. But something in the older woman's carefully neutral expression told Elena that any direct question would only be met with another polished, careful non-answer, the kind designed to end a conversation rather than continue it. Instead, she chose patience, telling herself that Gideon had promised answers, and that pushing too hard too quickly might only make him retreat further behind his careful walls. She spent the morning quietly, watching the water level outside slowly begin to recede for the first time since the flood began, a small sign of hope that the outside world had not been entirely lost beneath the storm. Yet even as the flood began to ease, Elena understood that a different kind of current had already pulled her somewhere she could not easily swim back from. Whatever secrets lived behind that red door, whatever truth Gideon had promised to eventually share, she sensed that once she learned it fully, there would be no way to simply return to the ordinary life she had lived before the storm swept her up that hill. And for the first time since the flood had forced her up that hill, Elena began to wonder if the greatest danger she faced was not the rising water outside, but the secrets waiting quietly behind a single red door. Elena barely slept that night, and when morning came, she found herself sitting at the breakfast table across from Gideon, with a heavy silence stretching between them. Neither of them mentioned the events of the previous night directly, though the memory of glowing eyes and a dangerous stranger named Marcus sat between them like an unspoken weight neither was ready to lift. "You said you would explain," Elena finally said, setting down her cup with a decisive click. "I think today qualifies as the right time." Gideon studied her for a long moment, something unreadable passing behind his pale eyes. "Not here," he said quietly. "Walk with me." He led her outside, onto a covered stone terrace that overlooked the flooded valley below. The rain had softened into a light mist, and for the first time in days, Elena could see patches of pale sky breaking through the heavy clouds. The air felt cooler out here, cleaner somehow, though the tension between them remained thick. "What you heard last night," Gideon began slowly, choosing his words with obvious care, "was not something I can easily explain in ordinary terms. And what you saw, the change in my eyes, the way I moved, that was not an illusion or a trick of poor lighting." Elena wrapped her arms around herself, though the chill she felt had little to do with the weather. "Then what was it?" she asked. Gideon exhaled slowly, his gaze drifting out toward the flooded valley, as if gathering courage from the distance. "There are people in this world," he said, "who are not entirely what they appear to be. People who carry within them something older, something tied to the moon and to bloodlines stretching back further than written history can properly account for." "You're talking about legends," Elena said carefully. "Stories." "I am talking about my family," Gideon corrected gently. "About what we are, and what I have been for a very long time." Elena's heart pounded as she waited for him to continue, though some part of her had already begun connecting the pieces from the old book in the library, from the strange growling sounds, from the impossible date on that centuries-old portrait. "The house has been in my family for generations," Gideon continued, "because I am the one who has lived in it across all those generations. Not descendants carrying my likeness, me, the same person, the same eyes, the same blood, for far longer than any normal life should allow." "That's not possible," Elena said, though her voice lacked full conviction even as she said it. "I understand how it sounds," Gideon said, turning to face her fully now. "But you have already seen things that ordinary explanations cannot cover. The portrait, the sounds in the night, my eyes changing in front of you. I would rather you hear the truth from me directly than continue piecing it together from fear and half-answers." Elena's mind raced, trying to reconcile everything she had witnessed with what he was telling her. "How old are you?" she finally asked, the question feeling strange and enormous even as it left her lips. Gideon held her gaze steadily. 300 years, he said. "Give or take a handful of seasons I have long since stopped counting precisely." The number landed heavily in the space between them. Elena took a step back, needing the distance to process what she had just heard, though Gideon made no move to close it, giving her the space she clearly needed. 300 years, she repeated slowly. "That's not something a person just says over breakfast." "I am aware," Gideon said, a faint, tired smile touching his lips despite the seriousness of the conversation. "Which is why I have been reluctant to say it at all." "And the growling," Elena pressed, her voice steadier now, driven by a need to understand rather than simply react. "The voices behind the red door. Is that connected to what you're telling me?" Gideon nodded slowly. "I lead others like myself," he said. "A community bound by blood and by tradition, older than most nations currently standing. What you heard last night was a gathering of my kind, discussing matters that concern all of us, matters made more complicated by your unexpected presence in this house." "Your kind," Elena echoed. "What exactly are you, Gideon?" He held her gaze for a long, steady moment before answering. "We are commonly called shifters," he said, "those capable of taking the form of wolves, tied deeply to instinct and to the pull of the moon. I am not simply one among many. I hold a position of leadership over our entire community, a role passed down through strength and bloodline, rather than simple inheritance. Among my kind, I am known as the Alpha King." Elena felt the ground shift beneath her, though she remained standing perfectly still. Every strange detail from the past 3 days suddenly clicked together with terrifying clarity. The ageless staff, the old portrait, the growling voices, the stranger named Marcus who had looked at her like she was a threat to be managed. "This is real," she said quietly, more to herself than to him. "All of this is actually real." "It is," Gideon confirmed gently. "And I understand if that truth frightens you. Most humans who learn what I have just told you either run or refuse to believe it entirely. I would not blame you for either response. Elena studied him carefully, searching his face for any sign of deception, finding none. Instead, she saw something far more complicated, a kind of weary honesty, carried by someone who had clearly held this secret for far longer than she could properly imagine. "Why tell me at all?" she asked. "You could have simply sent me on my way once the flood passed. Let me believe whatever explanation was easiest." Gideon's expression softened, something vulnerable slipping through his usually careful composure. "Because keeping this from you any longer felt wrong," he said quietly. "And because Marcus is right about one thing. A human who knows this truth carries a certain danger, both to herself and to my people. I would rather you understand that danger clearly than stumble into it blindly." "What kind of danger?" Elena asked, a fresh wave of unease building in her chest. "Not every leader among our kind values discretion the way I do," Gideon said carefully. "Some see any human awareness of our world as an unacceptable risk, one that must be eliminated rather than managed. If word spreads that you know the truth about what lives in this house, you may become a target for those who do not share my patience." Elena's breath caught. "A target," she repeated. "Because of what I know." "Yes," Gideon said simply. No attempt at softening the weight of the word. "Which is why, for now, staying within these walls remains the safest choice available to you, even once the flood finally recedes." "And if I chose to leave anyway?" Elena asked, needing to understand the full scope of her situation. "Once the road's clear? Once I could go home again?" Gideon's expression grew troubled. "I would not stop you," he said carefully. "The choice would remain entirely yours. But I would worry for your safety every day you remained unprotected, knowing what you know, without any shield against those who might see you as a threat to be removed, rather than a person to be respected." "That sounds less like a choice, and more like a cage dressed up politely," Elena said, though without real anger in her voice, more simple honesty than accusation. "I understand why it might feel that way," Gideon admitted. "I do not wish to trap you here, Elena. I wish only for you to understand clearly what returning to an ordinary life might now cost you, so that whatever you choose it with full knowledge, rather than false comfort." The conversation left Elena reeling, standing on a stone terrace overlooking a flooded valley, having just learned that the man who saved her from drowning was 300 years old and led a hidden world of creatures she had only ever encountered in old stories and films. Fear pulled at her chest, cold and sharp, yet beneath it ran something else entirely, a strange thread of fascination she could not fully deny. "I need time," she finally said, her voice quieter now, exhausted from the weight of everything she had just absorbed. "Time to think about all of this." "Of course," Gideon said immediately, stepping back to give her room, both physically and emotionally. "Take whatever time you need. I will not press you further today." Elena nodded and turned to walk back inside, her mind spinning with questions she had not yet found the courage to ask. Behind her, Gideon remained on the terrace a while longer, watching the mist drift over the flooded valley, his expression carrying the weight of a secret finally shared, after centuries of careful silence. For Elena, the rest of the day passed in a haze of quiet reflection. She wandered the halls of the ancient house with new eyes, seeing every detail differently now: the preserved furniture, the ageless staff, the portrait in the library that had never truly been an ancestor at all. The world she thought she understood had shifted permanently beneath her feet, and there was no simple way to shift it back into place. That night, as she lay awake listening to the last traces of rain against her window, Elena found herself thinking not of fear, but of the careful, guarded honesty in Gideon's pale gray eyes as he had told her the truth. Whatever danger lay ahead, whatever complications her presence might bring to a world 300 years in the making, some part of her had already decided she could not simply walk away from it, even if the flood outside finally allowed her to try. A loud crack split through the house before dawn, sharp enough to jolt Elena upright in bed, her heart already racing before she fully understood what had happened. The sound came again, followed by a deep groan of stressed wood, and she realized with growing alarm that it was coming from somewhere close, possibly directly above her room. She threw open her door just as Agnes rushed past in the hallway, her usually composed expression tight with urgency. "Stay back," Agnes called over her shoulder. "The east wing roof has taken damage from the storm. Beams are giving way. Elena's pulse spiked. Days of relentless rain had clearly weakened parts of the old structure, and now the house itself seemed to be fighting the same flood that had driven her here in the first place. She followed Agnes at a careful distance, watching staff members rushing in different directions, shouting instructions Elena only partly understood. Then she heard it, a sound of wood tearing apart entirely, followed by a scream from somewhere further down the hallway. Elena's instincts took over before caution could stop her, and she ran toward the sound instead of away from it. She found a young staff member trapped beneath a fallen support beam in a narrow side corridor, the ceiling above cracked and sagging dangerously, threatening further collapse at any moment. Dust and debris hung thick in the air, and the young woman cried out in pain, unable to free her leg from beneath the heavy wood. "I'm here," Elena said quickly, dropping to her knees beside her. "Help is coming." She grabbed hold of the beam and pulled with everything she had, but it did not move even slightly. Above them, the damaged ceiling groaned again, shifting, dust raining down, in a way that made Elena's stomach twist with fear. There was no time to wait for more help. The whole section looked ready to collapse entirely. "Elena, move back." Gideon's voice cut through the chaos like a blade, and she looked up just in time to see him sprinting down the corridor toward them, moving with a speed that did not seem entirely human. She scrambled backward, pulling the injured woman's shoulders with her as far as the space allowed, just as a heavier section of ceiling gave way completely, crashing down exactly where Elena had been kneeling moments before. Gideon reached them in an instant, and without hesitation, gripped the fallen beam with both hands and lifted it as though it weighed nothing at all, despite its clear, immense weight. Elena stared, momentarily frozen, as muscles she had never noticed before strained visibly beneath his shirt, his strength clearly far beyond anything a normal man could summon. "Pull her free now," Gideon commanded, his voice steady despite the effort clearly required to hold the beam aloft. Elena snapped back into motion, carefully dragging the injured staff member free from beneath the wood. The moment she was clear, Gideon released the beam, letting it fall the rest of the way to the floor with a heavy, echoing crash. Dust filled the air around them, and for a long moment, all three of them simply breathed, shaken but alive. "Is she all right?" Elena asked, checking the young woman's leg, relieved to find it bruised and swollen but not broken. "She will heal," Gideon said, kneeling beside them both, his eyes scanning quickly for any further danger. "Our kind mends faster than most." Elena looked up at him sharply. "She's like you? One of your people?" Gideon nodded, helping the injured woman to her feet with careful, gentle hands. "Most who work within this house share my nature," he explained. "It allows for a level of trust and discretion I could not otherwise maintain." Once the injured woman had been safely escorted to another part of the house for rest, Elena found herself alone with Gideon, in the damaged corridor, both of them covered in a light layer of dust, adrenaline still coursing through her system. "You lifted that beam like it was nothing," she said, still processing what she had witnessed. "That wasn't just quick reflexes, that was something else entirely." "I told you the truth," Gideon said simply. "This is part of what that truth means. Strength beyond ordinary limits. Speed beyond what your eyes are accustomed to tracking. It comes with what I am." Elena studied him carefully, noticing now details she had somehow overlooked before. The faint scars along his forearms that never seemed to fade with time. The way his eyes still held a trace of that unnatural glow even now, hours removed from whatever gathering had taken place behind the red door. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for saving her. For saving me too, probably, if that ceiling had come down a few seconds sooner." "I would not have let anything happen to you," Gideon said, his voice carrying a weight and sincerity that made Elena's breath catch slightly. "Not after everything already at stake." The two of them stood in the damaged corridor a moment longer, the remaining tension between them shifting into something quieter, more complicated than fear alone. Elena found herself studying his face, searching for the monster she had been taught to fear in old stories, finding instead only the same careful, protective man who had opened his door to her during a flood, without knowing anything about her at all. "I have more questions," she admitted eventually, "about all of this, about what happens now." "I expected as much," Gideon said, a faint, tired smile crossing his lips. Perhaps somewhere with less fallen debris would suit a longer conversation. They made their way to the library, settling into chairs near the fireplace, while staff worked to repair the damage elsewhere in the house. Elena wrapped her hands around a warm cup Agnes brought her, grateful for the small comfort as she gathered her thoughts. The others like you, she began carefully. Marcus, and whoever else was behind that door. Do they all live here, in this house? Some do, Gideon said. Others live scattered across the region, answering to me when matters require it. My role as Alpha King means the well-being of my entire community rests, in some measure, on decisions I make. And my presence here complicates those decisions, Elena said, recalling his earlier warning. It does, Gideon admitted. Not because of anything you have done, but simply because you now know something most humans never learn. Some among my people believe that knowledge alone makes you dangerous, regardless of your intentions. Elena considered this carefully, turning the warm cup in her hands. What do you believe? She asked. Gideon met her eyes steadily. I believe you ran toward a lit window during a flood instead of hiding in fear, he said. I believe you rushed toward danger this morning, to help someone you had never even met, rather than protecting yourself first. Whatever else may be true, I do not believe you are a danger to my people, Elena. If anything, I suspect the opposite. The warmth in his words settled somewhere deep in Elena's chest, chasing away some of the fear that had gripped her since the previous night. Still, an undercurrent of unease remained, a quiet awareness that whatever was building between them existed against a backdrop of real danger, danger that extended far beyond fallen beams and storm damage. Outside, the rain continued falling steadily, though something in the atmosphere of the house felt different now, charged with an energy that had nothing to do with weather at all. She found Agnes later that afternoon in the sitting room, folding linens with the same quiet efficiency she brought to every task. Elena hesitated at the doorway before stepping inside, unsure how much the older woman already knew about the conversation that had taken place on the terrace that morning. He told you, Agnes said simply, not looking up from her work, though her tone carried no surprise. He did, Elena confirmed, sitting down across from her. I am still trying to understand all of it. Agnes set the linens aside and studied Elena carefully, her expression softening into something more open than the careful politeness she had shown since the first night. I have served this family for a very long time, she said, long enough to remember when Master Gideon first took on the responsibilities of leadership, back when the world outside these walls looked very different from the one you know now. How long have you known him? Elena asked, curious, despite the strangeness of the question. Longer than most humans would believe possible, Agnes said, a faint, knowing smile touching her lips. I am not entirely human myself, dear, though my gifts run quieter than his. I age slowly, far slower than an ordinary person, though not so slowly as he does. It allows me to serve this house across generations that would otherwise wear down an ordinary staff member entirely. Elena absorbed this new piece of the puzzle carefully, understanding now why the household had felt so strangely timeless from the very first night. Does everyone here share some version of that gift? She asked. Most do, Agnes confirmed. Master Gideon surrounds himself only with those he trusts completely. And trust, in our world, often runs deepest among those who share the same nature. And now he has extended that trust to me, Elena said quietly, more to herself than to Agnes. He has, Agnes agreed, studying her with careful, searching eyes. Which tells me more about his feelings toward you than any words he might choose to say directly. Master Gideon has never been a man who shares his truth lightly, dear, not in 300 years. Has he ever tried, before now? Elena asked carefully. Told a human the truth, I mean. Agnes considered the question, her expression growing distant with old memory. Once, she said quietly. Many decades ago, before you were born. It did not end well. The woman could not accept what he was, and fear drove her away long before love had the chance to grow into anything lasting. He has been careful ever since, perhaps too careful, closing himself off from any possibility of that kind of hurt happening again. Elena absorbed this quietly, understanding now the depth of the risk Gideon had taken by choosing to trust her so quickly. Thank you for telling me, she said. It helps me understand him a little better. He deserves someone who sees the man beneath the centuries, Agnes said simply. Not simply the legend, or the leader, or the creature from old stories. I suspect you may be exactly that, dear, if you allow yourself the chance. The words settled warmly in Elena's chest, chasing away some of the fear that had gripped her since learning the full truth. Elena did not yet know what challenges truly lay ahead, but she understood, with growing certainty, that her time in this ancient house had only just begun to reveal its deepest secrets. A sharp knock at the library door interrupted their quiet conversation before Elena could ask another question. Marcus stepped inside without waiting for permission, his expression grim, his eyes flicking briefly toward Elena before settling on Gideon with clear urgency. "We need to speak," Marcus said. "Now." Gideon rose immediately, sensing the seriousness in his tone. "Elena, stay here," he said. "I will return shortly." She nodded, watching them leave together, the heavy library door closing behind them with a final click. Alone, Elena sat with her thoughts racing, replaying everything Gideon had told her, everything she had witnessed with her own eyes. 300 years. Alpha King. A hidden world of shifters living quietly behind ordinary human lives. It should have terrified her more than it did. Instead, sitting alone in the quiet library, surrounded by centuries-old books recording a history she had only just learned existed, Elena felt something closer to awe settling over her fear. She thought of the portrait upstairs, of Gideon's face unchanged across 200 years, of the immense strength she had witnessed him display, without a moment's hesitation to save a stranger's life. Whatever he was, whatever ancient world he ruled over, he had chosen kindness in every moment that truly mattered. Nearly an hour passed before Gideon returned, his expression heavier than before, carrying a weight Elena had not seen on him previously. He sat across from her, running a hand through his dark hair, clearly troubled by whatever conversation had just taken place. "What happened?" Elena asked carefully. Gideon exhaled slowly. "Word has reached other territories," he said, "about your presence here, about what you now know. News like this does not stay contained easily, even within careful circles." Elena's stomach tightened. "How bad is it?" "There is a leader from a neighboring territory," Gideon explained, his voice controlled despite clear tension underlying it. "His name is Dorian. He has never fully respected the boundaries between our world and the human one, and he sees any human awareness of our existence as an opportunity rather than a risk to be managed carefully." "An opportunity for what?" Elena asked, though she suspected she already understood the answer would not comfort her. "Leverage," Gideon said simply. "Against me, against my leadership, against the stability I have worked centuries to maintain. If Dorian believes he can use your presence here to challenge my authority or destabilize my territory, he will not hesitate to act." Elena's hands tightened around the fabric of her sleeves. "What does that mean for me?" Gideon met her eyes directly, his expression serious. "It means you are no longer simply a guest sheltering from a flood," he said. "Whether you wish it or not, your presence here has become tied to matters of significant consequence within my world." "So what happens now?" Elena asked, her voice steadier than she expected, driven by a growing determination to face whatever came next, rather than simply react in fear. "I will not allow harm to come to you," Gideon said firmly, leaning forward slightly. "But protecting you properly may require decisions neither of us anticipated when you first knocked on my door." "What kind of decisions?" Gideon hesitated, choosing his next words with obvious care. "Among my people, there are protections that can be extended to those under an alpha's direct claim," he said slowly. "Bonds that make clear, beyond any dispute, that someone falls under my personal protection, backed by the full weight of my authority and my bloodline." Elena studied him carefully, sensing there was more beneath his careful phrasing than he was fully expressing. "And if you extended that protection to me?" "It would make you a target of a different kind," Gideon admitted honestly. "Some among my rivals would see it as provocation rather than deterrence. But it would also mean no one could act against you without directly challenging me. And that is a challenge few among my kind would risk lightly." The weight of the choice settled heavily between them. Elena thought of everything she had witnessed over the past days, the impossible portrait, the glowing eyes, the immense strength that had saved a life without hesitation. She thought of Gideon's careful honesty, his protective instincts, the centuries of leadership visible in every measured word he spoke. "I trust you," she said finally, surprising herself slightly with the certainty in her own voice. "Whatever this protection means, whatever risks come with it, I would rather face them with your protection than without it." Something shifted in Gideon's expression, relief mixing with a complicated tenderness he did not fully hide. "You do not fully understand what you are agreeing to," he said quietly. "Then explain it to me properly," Elena said. "All of it. No more careful half-truths." Gideon nodded slowly, seeming to gather himself before continuing. "Among my kind, a bond between an alpha and another carries deep significance," he said. "It is not simply a matter of protection, extended out of duty. It ties two lives together, in ways that grow stronger over time, through choice, and through trust, freely given." "Are you saying this bond is more than political protection?" Elena asked carefully. "I am saying it can become more," Gideon said honestly. "Whether it does depends entirely on what grows between the two people involved, not on any formal declaration alone." Elena felt heat rise in her cheeks, though she held his gaze steadily despite it. Whatever fear had gripped her over the past days had not disappeared entirely, but it had shifted, tempered now by a growing trust in the man sitting across from her, a man who had proven through actions rather than words alone that his intentions toward her carried genuine care. "Then let us begin with the protection," she said, "and allow whatever else grows between us to happen honestly, in its own time." Gideon's expression softened into something Elena had not yet seen from him, a rare, unguarded warmth breaking through his usual careful composure. "Very well," he said quietly. "Then know this clearly, Elena Brooks. From this moment forward, you stand under my protection, and any who threaten you, threaten the full weight of everything I have built across 3 centuries." The words carried a formality that felt almost ceremonial, and Elena sensed, without fully understanding the mechanics of it, that something significant had shifted in that moment, something that extended beyond simple words, into whatever strange, ancient world Gideon truly belonged to. Outside, the storm continued, though the immediate danger of flooding had begun finally to ease. A different kind of danger had taken its place now, one carried not by rising water, but by rival ambitions stirring in territories beyond the walls of this ancient house. Later that afternoon, Elena visited the injured staff member she had helped pull free from beneath the fallen beam. The young woman, whose name Elena learned was Nora, sat propped up in bed, her leg already showing remarkable signs of healing, despite the injury having occurred only hours earlier. "Thank you," Nora said, her voice still a little shaky, "for staying with me. I know it must have looked frightening, seeing this kind of injury heal so quickly." "It was surprising," Elena admitted, sitting carefully beside the bed. "But I'm glad you're healing so well. How long have you worked here, Nora?" "Almost 40 years, Nora said, a small smile touching her lips at Elena's obvious surprise. "I do not look it, I know. Our kind ages slowly once we reach adulthood. Slower still for those closest to an alpha's bloodline. It has its advantages, though it also means watching the human world change around us far more quickly than we change ourselves." Elena considered this, turning the information over carefully in her mind. "Do you ever miss living an ordinary human life?" she asked. "Growing old normally, without all of this hidden underneath it?" Nora considered the question seriously before answering. "Sometimes," she admitted. "There are quiet moments, watching human friends grow old and pass on while I remain unchanged, when the weight of it settles heavily. But I have also seen Master Gideon lead our people through hardships that would have destroyed lesser leaders. I have watched him choose protection over convenience, patience over cruelty, time and time again across the decades I have served him. Whatever I have given up in ordinary human simplicity, I have gained in loyalty to someone who has more than earned it." "Has this territory always been peaceful?" Elena asked, curious about the history Nora carried within her. "Not always," Nora said, her expression growing more serious. "I remember conflicts decades past, disputes between territories that threatened to spill into violence more than once. Master Gideon settled each one through patience and careful diplomacy, rather than unnecessary force, though I know it cost him greatly each time. He carries the weight of every difficult decision quietly, rarely allowing others to see how heavily it rests on him." "That sounds like a lonely way to lead," Elena said softly. "It is," Nora agreed, "which is perhaps why seeing him open up to you, even slightly, has given many of us here a quiet kind of hope." The conversation stayed with Elena long after she left Nora's room, coloring her understanding of Gideon in a new light. He was not simply a man carrying an extraordinary secret. He was a leader whose choices had shaped the lives of countless people across centuries. People who spoke of him, not with fear, but with genuine respect and gratitude. That evening, as she settled once more into the quiet comfort of the library, Elena found herself looking forward to the moment Gideon would join her, eager to understand more about the world he had opened to her, rather than simply fearing it. Elena did not yet know what challenges truly awaited her, but for the first time since the flood had driven her up that hill, she felt something steady beneath her fear. She was no longer facing this strange new world alone. News of the formal protection spread through the house quickly, and Elena noticed an immediate shift in how the staff treated her. Where before she had received polite hospitality reserved for a stranded guest, now she received a deeper, more deliberate respect, as though her place within the household had fundamentally changed overnight. Agnes, in particular, seemed to soften toward her, offering small, genuine smiles instead of the careful, guarded politeness from before. "You have chosen a difficult path," Agnes said one morning, helping Elena select warmer clothing from a wardrobe that had mysteriously begun filling with items suited perfectly to her size. "But not an unwise one. Everyone keeps telling me how difficult this path will be," Elena said, only half joking. "I would appreciate hearing more about why it might also be worthwhile." Agnes considered this for a moment, folding a soft sweater carefully before answering. "Master Gideon has led our people for 3 centuries, she said. "In all that time, I have never seen him extend his protection to anyone the way he has extended it to you. That alone should tell you something important." Elena absorbed this quietly, turning the words over in her mind throughout the rest of the morning. She spent time with Gideon in the following days, learning more about the world he inhabited, a world layered quietly beneath ordinary human life, governed by traditions older than most recorded history. He told her about the moon's pull on his kind, how certain nights carried significance beyond simple folklore, how his community gathered periodically to honor traditions passed down across countless generations. He told her about the loneliness of leading for 3 centuries, watching human lives pass quickly around him, while his own stretched on seemingly without end. "Does it ever become easier?" Elena asked one evening, as they sat together near the library fireplace, the storm outside finally beginning to show signs of weakening. "Watching everyone around you grow old while you remain unchanged?" Gideon's expression grew distant, touched by something old and heavy. "No," he admitted honestly. "It never becomes easier. I have watched entire generations of my closest companions live full lives and pass on, while I remained exactly as I am now. It is perhaps the heaviest burden that comes with what I am." "I'm sorry," Elena said softly, understanding now why his careful guardedness made sense, why he had hesitated so long before revealing his true nature to her. "Do not be sorry," Gideon said, meeting her eyes with unexpected warmth. "For the first time in longer than I care to count, meeting someone new has brought something other than eventual, inevitable loss to mind." Elena felt her heart quicken at his words, the careful walls she had maintained around her own feelings beginning to soften in response to his honesty. Over the following days, their conversations grew easier, more natural, filled with genuine curiosity rather than careful caution. She learned he enjoyed reading history, finding comfort in watching human civilizations rise and evolve across the centuries he had personally witnessed. She learned he had a quiet sense of humor, dry and understated, that occasionally slipped through his usually serious demeanor. She learned that despite 300 years of experience, he remained genuinely uncertain about matters of the heart, having guarded himself carefully against attachment for longer than she could properly imagine. One afternoon, while walking through an old orchard behind the estate, Gideon told her about the first century of his rule, when the responsibilities of leadership had felt impossibly heavy for someone barely a few decades into his transformed life. "I made mistakes then," he admitted. "Harsh decisions born from fear rather than wisdom. It took many years and many painful lessons before I learned that true strength lies in patience rather than force." "What changed you?" Elena asked, walking beside him beneath the old, twisted branches. "Watching leaders who ruled through fear alone eventually lose everything," Gideon said, their own people turning against them the moment weakness appeared. "I decided early on that I would rather be trusted than feared, even if trust took longer to build and proved harder to maintain." Elena found herself admiring him more with every story he shared, each one revealing another layer beneath the careful, guarded exterior he had first shown her during the storm. In turn, Gideon learned about her ordinary human life, her work, her family, the small joys and frustrations that filled her days, before the flood had swept her unexpectedly into his world. He listened with genuine fascination, treating even her simplest stories as though they held real significance, a stark contrast to the weight of centuries he carried within himself. One evening, as they walked together through the gardens behind the house, the rain finally reduced to a light mist. Elena found herself studying his profile in the fading evening light, struck by how easily she had come to trust someone whose existence defied everything she had previously understood about reality. "Can I ask you something honestly?" she said, as they paused beside an old stone fountain, its water finally beginning to run clear again after days of storm debris. "Always," Gideon said, turning to face her fully. "Are you afraid of what might happen because of me?" Elena asked. "Because of the danger my presence has brought to your world?" Gideon considered the question carefully before answering. "I am afraid of many things," he admitted. "I am afraid of the danger Dorian represents, not simply to you, but to the stability I have worked centuries to build. I am afraid of decisions I may be forced to make in order to protect what matters most to me." "And am I one of those things that matters most to you now?" Elena asked quietly, holding his gaze steadily despite the vulnerability the question required. Gideon stepped closer, his expression open in a way she had rarely seen from him. "Yes," he said simply, without hesitation. "More than I fully anticipated when you first knocked on my door during that storm." The honesty in his voice settled warmly in Elena's chest, chasing away whatever remaining doubts had lingered since she first learned the truth about him. Whatever fear she still carried about the dangers ahead, it no longer outweighed the growing certainty that whatever connection had formed between them was worth protecting, worth facing challenges for, regardless of how strange the circumstances of their meeting had been. "Then we face whatever comes next together," Elena said firmly. Gideon reached out, taking her hand gently in his pale gray eyes holding hers with quiet intensity. "Together," he agreed softly. As the last light of evening faded behind the garden walls, neither of them noticed the distant figure watching from beyond the tree line, hidden carefully in shadow, reporting silently back to a rival territory that had begun making plans of its own. The peace Elena and Gideon had found together, however genuine, remained fragile, threatened by ambitions gathering quietly in the darkness, beyond the safety of the ancient house. Later that night, once the household had settled into quiet, Elena sat with Gideon by the fire once more. The formal weight of the protection now settled fully between them. She found herself studying his face in the firelight, noticing small details she had missed before, the faint lines at the corners of his eyes that spoke of centuries of careful thought rather than simple age, the quiet steadiness in his hands as he turned a cup slowly between them. "Tell me something about your past," Elena said softly. "Something from long ago, before all of this." Gideon considered the request for a long moment, memory clearly stirring behind his pale eyes. "I remember a winter, more than 2 centuries past," he said eventually, "when famine threatened the human villages near my territory. My people could have simply retreated further into the forest, protected our own, and left the humans to their fate. Instead, I chose to quietly guide game toward their hunting grounds, to ensure enough food reached them through the worst of the season." "Why?" Elena asked, genuinely curious. "Why risk exposure for people who did not know you existed?" "Because leadership means more than simple survival," Gideon said. "It means choosing compassion, even when caution would be easier. I have carried that belief across every century since, even when it has cost me more than I expected." "What did it cost you?" Elena asked gently. Gideon was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire before answering. "Trust, sometimes," he said. "Not every leader among my kind agreed with my choice that winter. Some called it foolish, a risk that could have exposed our entire community to discovery. I nearly lost the support of several close allies over that single decision, but I have never regretted it. The villagers survived that winter, and generations of their descendants still live in the town below this hill, entirely unaware of the debt their ancestors owe to a choice made quietly in the dark." "Do you ever wonder what happened to them?" Elena asked. "The families you helped, I mean." "Often," Gideon admitted, a faint, wistful smile touching his lips. "I have watched their descendants pass through these lands across the centuries since, never knowing the connection, never needing to know. It is enough for me simply to have made the choice, regardless of whether it was ever recognized. Elena felt something warm settle in her chest at his words, admiration mixing freely with the growing affection she could no longer fully deny. "That kind of choice explains why your people speak of you the way they do," she said, with genuine respect, not simply obedience. "I have tried to earn that respect honestly," Gideon said quietly, "rather than simply demand it through strength alone." They sat together a while longer, the conversation drifting easily between old memories and quiet questions, each exchange deepening the trust building steadily between them. For now, standing together beside the old stone fountain earlier, and now settled comfortably by the fire, both of them allowed themselves a rare, quiet moment of comfort, unaware of how soon that fragile peace would be tested by forces neither of them could fully control. The message arrived just before dawn, carried by a breathless messenger who had traveled through the remaining floodwater on foot rather than risk a delay. Elena woke to raised voices echoing through the house, urgent and tense in a way that immediately set her nerves on edge. She dressed quickly and made her way toward the main hall, finding Gideon standing with Marcus and several other members of his community, all of them gathered around a small, folded letter that seemed to have thrown the entire household into sudden alarm. "What's happened?" Elena asked, stepping into the room. Gideon looked up, his expression grim, though he did not hesitate to answer her honestly. "Dorian has sent formal word," he said. "He knows of the bond formed between us, and he intends to challenge it directly." "Challenge it how?" Elena asked, her stomach tightening. "He claims the protection extended to a human threatens the balance between our world and yours," Gideon explained. "He has called for a formal gathering of territorial leaders, demanding I answer for the risk your presence supposedly represents." "That sounds like a trial," Elena said quietly. "In many ways it is," Marcus said, his tone sharp with clear disapproval. "Dorian has wanted an opportunity to challenge Gideon's authority for a long time. This gives him the perfect excuse to do so publicly, in front of leaders whose support Gideon depends on." Elena looked toward Gideon, searching his face for reassurance she was not entirely certain existed. What happens if he wins this challenge? The silence that followed answered the question more clearly than words could have. Gideon's jaw tightened, his eyes carrying a weight Elena had not seen from him before, not even when he first revealed the truth about his nature. "I will not allow that outcome," Gideon said firmly, though the tension in his voice suggested even he understood the difficulty of the fight ahead. "But Dorian has clearly been preparing for this moment. He would not have made his move without confidence in his position." "Can he actually defeat you?" Elena asked, the question difficult to voice but necessary to ask directly. Marcus answered before Gideon could. "Unlikely," he said, "but not impossible. Dorian has spent years training specifically for a challenge like this, gathering strength through methods some would call reckless. Gideon has always ruled through balance rather than raw power alone. It has served him well for 3 centuries, but Dorian is betting everything on the idea that balance will not be enough this time." Gideon's expression remained calm, despite the weight of Marcus's words. "I have faced difficult challenges before," he said. "I will face this one as well, with the same care and preparation I have always relied on." Over the following hours, the household transformed into a flurry of careful preparation. Gideon met privately with his most trusted advisors, planning arguments and strategies for the gathering that now loomed only days away. Elena found herself largely excluded from these private discussions, though she refused to remain passive, insisting instead on understanding every detail of the danger she had unknowingly brought into Gideon's world. "I want to help," she told him one evening, finding him alone in his study, surrounded by old maps and documents detailing territorial boundaries stretching back centuries. "Not simply hide here while others fight over what happens to me." Gideon looked up, exhaustion visible beneath his usual composed exterior. "This is not a fight you can help with directly, Elena," he said. "Dorian's challenge concerns matters of leadership and tradition among my kind. Your presence at the gathering itself may only inflame tensions further." "Then let me understand the risks properly at least," Elena pressed. "I refuse to sit quietly while my presence here threatens everything you've built." Gideon studied her for a long moment, before finally relenting, gesturing for her to sit across from him. "Dorian leads a territory to the north," he explained, tracing a section of one old map with his finger. "He has long resented the boundaries our ancestors established, boundaries meant to prevent conflicts like the one now unfolding. If he succeeds in weakening my authority through this challenge, he will use the opportunity to expand his own influence, likely at significant cost to smaller, weaker territories caught between us. So this isn't only about me, Elena said slowly, understanding dawning. It's about protecting an entire system of peace you've maintained for centuries. Precisely, Gideon confirmed, which is why losing this challenge carries consequences far beyond simply losing you to danger. It could unravel stability I have worked centuries to preserve. The weight of this realization settled heavily on Elena's shoulders. She had known her presence complicated things, but she had not fully understood the scale of what truly hung in the balance. Whatever personal fear she carried about her own safety now felt secondary to the responsibility she suddenly recognized toward the wider community Gideon protected. Then we need to win, she said firmly, whatever it takes. Gideon's expression softened slightly at her determination, though worry remained clearly visible behind his eyes. The gathering will test more than simple arguments, he admitted. Tradition allows for challenges of strength as well as words, should negotiations fail to reach resolution. Dorian is strong, Elena. Stronger than most leaders currently active among our kind. Are you strong enough to face him? Elena asked carefully. I have never lost a direct challenge in 300 years, Gideon said, though his voice lacked the full confidence such a statement usually carried. But Dorian has spent decades specifically preparing for a moment like this. I would be foolish to underestimate him. That night, unable to sleep, Elena found herself standing at her window, watching the last remnants of floodwater finally beginning to recede from the valley below. The world outside was slowly returning to normal, yet the world inside these walls remained anything but settled, teetering instead on the edge of a conflict that could reshape everything she had come to care about in the span of just a few short days. She thought of Gideon's centuries of careful leadership, of the peace he had maintained across generations of his people, of the quiet vulnerability he had shown her when admitting his fears about the challenge ahead. Whatever came next, she understood clearly now that she could not simply remain a passive observer while others decided her fate and the fate of an entire hidden world alongside it. The following day, Elena sought out Marcus, hoping to understand more about Dorian and the true scale of the threat he represented. She found him in the training yard behind the house, practicing careful, controlled movements that reminded her faintly of the strength Gideon had shown lifting the fallen beam. You do not trust me, Elena said, approaching him directly rather than waiting for an invitation. I would rather understand why than continue guessing. Marcus paused, studying her with the same sharp assessment he had shown the night they first met behind the red door. It is not personal, he said eventually. I have watched leaders fall before because of decisions made with good hearts and poor judgment. Gideon has ruled wisely for 3 centuries. I do not wish to see that undone because of a choice made too quickly. Then help me understand Dorian, Elena said. If I am going to be part of the reason this challenge exists, I would rather know exactly what we are facing. Marcus considered her request for a long moment before finally relenting. Dorian was once a respected leader, he said. Decades ago, before ambition hardened him into something colder. He believes strength alone should determine leadership. That compassion is a weakness Gideon can no longer afford to indulge. He has spent years building alliances among leaders who share that belief, waiting patiently for an opportunity to challenge Gideon's authority directly. And I have given him that opportunity, Elena said quietly. You have given him an excuse, Marcus corrected. The ambition already existed long before you knocked on that door. Do not carry guilt for simply existing, Elena. Carry determination instead, to ensure Gideon's judgment is proven correct before every leader watching. The advice settled firmly in Elena's mind over the following days, replacing some of her earlier guilt with a steadier resolve. She spent hours studying the old records in the library, learning what she could about territorial traditions and challenge customs, determined to understand every angle of the conflict rather than simply waiting passively for its outcome. Whatever the gathering demanded of them, Elena resolved quietly that night to stand beside Gideon fully, not as a burden requiring protection, but as someone willing to fight for the fragile peace now hanging so precariously in the balance. The gathering took place 3 nights later, in a wide clearing, deep within the forest surrounding Gideon's territory, a place clearly used for such purposes across countless generations. Elena arrived alongside Gideon's closest advisors, watching as leaders from surrounding territories gathered slowly beneath a sky finally clear of storm clouds, the full moon rising bright and steady above the tree line. Dorian arrived last, flanked by several members of his own community, his presence commanding immediate attention. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with sharp features and cold, calculating eyes that swept over the gathering with obvious confidence. When his gaze landed on Elena, something predatory flickered briefly across his expression before he looked away. "Gideon," Dorian said, his voice carrying easily across the clearing. "I see you have brought your human with you." Bold, given the nature of tonight's discussion. "She has as much right to witness this as anyone else present," Gideon replied evenly, his voice steady despite the clear tension building around them. "Speak your challenge plainly, Dorian, rather than wasting the gathering's time with unnecessary theater." Dorian's smile carried no warmth. "Very well," he said, turning to address the assembled leaders. "For centuries, our kind has maintained careful boundaries between our world and the human one, boundaries designed specifically to protect us from exposure and unnecessary risk. Gideon has broken that tradition by extending formal protection to a human who now carries full knowledge of our existence." Murmurs rippled through the gathered leaders, though Elena noticed several exchanging glances that suggested not everyone shared Dorian's outrage equally. "I challenge Gideon's judgment in this matter," Dorian continued, his voice growing louder, more forceful. "And I challenge his fitness to continue leading, if he cannot recognize the danger his actions have created for all of us." Gideon stepped forward, his own voice calm, but carrying an undeniable authority that filled the clearing. "The boundaries you speak of were established to prevent reckless exposure, not to condemn every human who happens to learn the truth through circumstances beyond their control," he said. "Elena did not seek out our world. She fled a flood and found shelter at my door. The choice to reveal the truth to her was mine alone, made after careful consideration, not reckless carelessness. A choice that now endangers every one of us," Dorian countered sharply. "A choice that has endangered no one," Gideon replied firmly. "Elena has proven herself trustworthy, courageous, and deserving of the protection I have extended. The only danger currently present in this clearing comes from your own ambitions, Dorian," dressed carefully in the language of tradition and caution. Dorian's expression darkened at the direct accusation. "Careful, Gideon," he warned. "Words alone will not settle this matter tonight." "Then let us settle it properly," Gideon said, his voice steady and unafraid. "Through whatever means tradition allows." The gathered leaders exchanged glances, clearly recognizing the shift in tone, as the conversation moved toward something far more serious than simple debate. An older leader stepped forward finally, someone Elena did not recognize, carrying an authority that suggested significant respect among those present. "If both parties agree," the elder said, "tradition allows this dispute to be settled through direct challenge, witnessed by all present. The outcome shall be considered final and binding upon both territories." Gideon nodded firmly. "I accept these terms." Dorian's confident smile returned. "As do I." Elena's heart pounded as she watched both men step into the center of the clearing, removing their outer garments in preparation for a transformation she had not yet witnessed firsthand. The gathered crowd fell into a heavy, expectant silence as moonlight bathed the clearing in pale silver light. What followed happened faster than Elena could fully track, both men shifting rapidly into powerful wolf forms, Gideon's fur dark as midnight, Dorian's a paler gray that seemed to catch and hold the moonlight unnervingly. The two creatures circled each other cautiously, muscles coiled with barely restrained power, eyes locked in fierce concentration. The challenge that followed tested both endurance and skill, rather than simple brute force. The two wolves matching each other's speed and strength, with surprising evenness. Elena watched, breath held, as the fight shifted back and forth across the clearing, neither combatant gaining a clear advantage for what felt like an agonizingly long stretch of time. Then, gradually, Elena noticed something shifting. Dorian's movements, though still powerful, began carrying subtle signs of strain, his advantage in raw strength apparently not matched by the same depth of endurance Gideon had cultivated across 3 centuries of careful discipline. Slowly, steadily, Gideon began pressing the advantage, his movements growing sharper, more controlled, forcing Dorian back toward the edge of the clearing. Finally, in one decisive movement, Gideon pinned Dorian firmly to the ground, asserting clear and undeniable dominance before the entire gathered assembly. A long, tense moment passed before Dorian, breathing heavily, finally yielded, his posture shifting into clear submission beneath Gideon's continued hold. The clearing erupted into a mixture of murmurs and quiet acknowledgement as both men shifted back into their human forms. Gideon standing tall despite visible exhaustion, Dorian remaining kneeled, his earlier confidence entirely stripped away. "The challenge is settled," the elder announced formally. "Gideon's authority stands unquestioned, and his claim over the human Elena is recognized as valid and binding across all territories present tonight." Dorian rose slowly, his expression carrying a mixture of frustration and grudging respect. "You fight well, Gideon," he said quietly. "Perhaps better than I anticipated. Perhaps you should remember that in the future," Gideon replied evenly, though without unnecessary cruelty in his tone. As the gathering began to disperse, Elena rushed to Gideon's side, relief and lingering fear tangled together in her chest. "Are you all right?" she asked, checking him carefully for injury. "I am," Gideon assured her, though clear exhaustion lingered in his voice. "It is finished now, Elena. The challenge is settled, and my authority remains secure." "And what about me?" Elena asked quietly. "What does tonight mean for my place in all of this?" Gideon took her hand gently, his gray eyes meeting hers with quiet, steady warmth despite everything they had just endured. "It means your place beside me is no longer simply granted through my protection alone," he said softly. "It has been recognized formally, before every leader who matters within our world." Elena felt something settle deeply within her chest, a mixture of relief and quiet wonder at how completely her life had transformed since the night she had knocked desperately on a stranger's door during a raging flood. Whatever challenges still lay ahead, tonight had proven something important, both to the gathered leaders and to herself. As the gathered leaders began making their way back toward their respective territories, the elder who had overseen the challenge approached Elena directly, studying her with quiet curiosity. "You watched that fight without flinching," the elder observed. "Most humans would have looked away, or fled entirely at the sight of such transformation." "I could not look away," Elena admitted honestly. "Not when the outcome mattered so much to someone I care for." The elder nodded slowly, something approving in her expression. "Gideon has chosen well," she said simply, before turning to follow the departing leaders back into the surrounding forest. Elena watched them go, the clearing slowly emptying until only Gideon's closest advisors remained, beginning the quiet work of restoring order after the tension of the night. Marcus approached her as the last of the visiting leaders disappeared beyond the tree line, his expression carrying something new, a grudging respect that had not been present in their earlier encounters. "You stayed through the entire challenge," he said, "even when it would have been easier to look away." "I told you once that I refused to be a burden," Elena replied. "I meant it." Marcus studied her a moment longer before offering a small, genuine nod. "Perhaps I misjudged you," he admitted. "Gideon's instincts have rarely failed him across 3 centuries. I should have trusted that instinct sooner." The acknowledgement meant more to Elena than she expected, a small but meaningful shift in a relationship that had begun with clear suspicion. As the clearing finally emptied entirely, Gideon returned to her side, exhaustion visible beneath his relief, and together, they made the quiet walk back toward the house, the full moon lighting their path through the forest. She belonged here now, fully and undeniably, standing beside a man 3 centuries old, in a world she had never imagined existed, until desperation had driven her up a single hill, during a storm that had changed everything. Weeks passed following the gathering, and the floodwaters that had once trapped Elena within Gideon's ancient home finally receded entirely, leaving behind a valley slowly rebuilding itself under clear skies. The roads reopened, connecting the isolated house once again to the ordinary human world Elena had left behind on that first desperate night. Yet, despite the roads standing open, Elena found herself in no hurry to leave. She sat with Gideon one quiet evening in the same library where she had first discovered the impossible portrait, the fire crackling gently beside them, casting warm light across shelves of books recording centuries of history most humans would never learn existed. Agnes moved quietly nearby, setting out tea with the same careful attentiveness she had shown from the very beginning. "Your sister has been trying to reach you," Gideon said gently, glancing toward the phone Elena had finally managed to charge and reconnect with the outside world. "She must be worried." Elena nodded, guilt tugging faintly at her chest. I spoke with her yesterday, she admitted. Told her I was safe, staying with someone who helped me during the flood. She wants me to come home soon. And what do you want? Gideon asked carefully, his tone gentle, despite the obvious weight behind the question. Elena considered the question seriously, turning her cup slowly between her hands as she gathered her thoughts. The past weeks had changed her, in ways she was still working to fully understand. She had witnessed a hidden world unlike anything she had previously imagined, had learned truths about strength, loyalty, and leadership that reshaped her entire understanding of reality. More than that, she had found something unexpected in Gideon himself, a connection that felt far too significant to simply walk away from now that danger had passed. I want to stay, she said finally, meeting his eyes steadily. Not because I feel trapped or obligated, but because this life, this world you've shown me, it feels like where I'm meant to be now. Gideon's expression softened into something Elena had rarely seen from him, a rare, unguarded vulnerability, breaking fully through his usual careful composure. Are you certain? He asked quietly. This life carries responsibilities and dangers unlike anything you knew before the flood brought you to my door. I would understand entirely if you chose an easier path instead. I've never wanted an easier path, Elena said, a small, genuine smile touching her lips. I ran toward a lit window during a flood, instead of sheltering in place. I rushed toward a collapsing ceiling to help someone I had never met. Easier paths were never really my style, Gideon. A soft laugh escaped him, warm and genuine, chasing away the last remnants of tension from his expression. No, he agreed. I suppose they were not. There is something else, Elena continued, her voice growing more serious. Something Agnes mentioned to me recently, about an old prophecy tied to certain human bloodlines. Gideon's expression grew thoughtful, though not entirely surprised. You have been reading the old records again, he said, though there was fondness rather than reproach in his tone. I found references to a bloodline capable of forming lasting bonds with leaders of our kind, Elena said carefully. Bonds tied to fate rather than simple circumstance. Agnes seemed to believe my own family history might connect to that old bloodline somehow. Gideon nodded slowly. I suspected as much from the moment you first knocked on my door, he admitted. There was something about you immediately that felt significant, beyond simple chance. The old records speak of humans marked by fate, drawn toward leaders of our kind, during moments of great upheaval, flood and storm, among the signs most commonly associated with such meetings. So this was never simply an accident, Elena said slowly, processing the weight of this revelation. Fate brought me to your door that night. Perhaps, Gideon said gently, or perhaps fate simply created the opportunity, and everything that followed grew from choices we both made freely afterward. Whatever the old prophecies claim, I believe what has grown between us stands on its own merit, built through trust and genuine connection rather than destiny alone. Elena considered this, finding comfort in his perspective. Whatever ancient forces might have guided her toward that hilltop house during the storm, everything that had happened since had been built through her own choices, her own courage, her own willingness to trust someone whose truth defied everything she previously understood about the world. Then let us build whatever comes next the same way, she said firmly, through choice, not simply through fate. Gideon reached across the small distance between them, taking her hand gently in his. Elena Brooks, he said, his voice carrying quiet formality mixed with genuine warmth. 300 years I have led my people alone, carrying burdens few could fully understand. I did not expect, after so long, to find someone willing to stand beside me so fully, so bravely. I did not expect to fall for a man 3 centuries old either, Elena replied, a soft smile touching her lips, despite the emotion building in her chest. Yet here we are. Here we are, Gideon agreed softly. He rose from his seat, drawing her up gently alongside him, leading her toward the tall library windows overlooking the now peaceful valley below, moonlight spilling softly across land that had once been consumed entirely by floodwater. The world outside had healed, slowly returning to its ordinary rhythms, while inside, these ancient walls, something entirely new had taken root. Stay, Gideon said simply, his eyes holding hers with quiet, steady certainty. Not simply as someone under my protection, but as someone standing fully beside me, sharing in everything this life has to offer, difficult and wonderful in equal measure. Elena looked out at the peaceful valley, then back toward the man who had opened his door to a stranger during a desperate storm. never imagining how completely that single choice would reshape both their lives. She thought of the courage it had taken to knock on that door in the first place, the courage it had taken to trust an impossible truth, the courage it would take to build a future within a world so different from anything she had known before. "I will stay," she said finally, her voice steady and certain. "For however long this life lasts, whatever challenges still wait ahead of us." Gideon smiled, warmth and relief mixing freely across his features, as he drew her closer beneath the soft glow of moonlight. Outside, the valley continued its quiet healing. Water finally receded, life slowly returning to normal. Inside, within the walls of an ancient house that had stood silently for 3 centuries, a new chapter had only just begun, built not on fate alone, but on courage, trust, and a connection neither of them had expected to find on an ordinary stormy night. The flood that had once threatened to take everything from Elena had instead given her something she never could have imagined: a place, a purpose, and a love 300 years in the making. In the weeks that followed, Elena traveled once more into the town below, this time not fleeing floodwater but simply visiting her sister, carrying with her a carefully prepared explanation that left out the truth about wolves and centuries and hidden bloodlines, replaced instead with a simpler story about a kind stranger who had sheltered her during the storm and asked her to stay on afterward. Her sister studied her carefully across a coffee shop table, noting the calm, steady happiness in Elena's eyes that had not been there before the flood. "You seem different," her sister said, "lighter, somehow." "I found something I did not know I was looking for," Elena said simply, unable to explain the full truth but unwilling to deny the happiness clearly visible on her face. When she returned to the ancient house on the hill, Gideon met her at the door, the same door she had once pounded on desperately during the worst storm of her life. This time, she walked through it not as a stranger seeking shelter, but as someone returning home. Agnes greeted her warmly in the entrance hall, already preparing the household for changes that would come with Elena's permanent place within it. Nora, fully healed now, offered a genuine smile as she passed, and even Marcus, standing near the study door, offered a respectful nod that carried none of his earlier suspicion. That evening, standing once again beside the library window overlooking the valley, now fully restored beneath clear skies and steady sunlight, Gideon turned to Elena with a quiet, searching expression. 300 years I walked through this house alone," he said softly, "watching seasons change, watching the world beyond these walls transform again and again, while I remained unchanged. I had long since stopped hoping that anything could feel new to me again." "And now?" Elena asked gently. "Now," Gideon said, drawing her close, "every single day feels like the beginning of something I never expected to find. You knocked on my door during a flood, Elena, never knowing what waited on the other side. I only hope you never regret staying to find out." "I never will," Elena said with quiet certainty, resting her head against his shoulder, as the sun set gently over the healed valley below. Whatever challenges still waited in the world beyond that hill, whatever future still lay unwritten before them, Elena faced it now without fear, standing beside a man 300 years in the making, finally ready to unfold into whatever future still lay ahead.